Thank you everyone for coming out. My name is Krista Alba and I'm the assistant curator here at Kemper Museum. I want to thank you all for joining us to celebrate the opening of our new special exhibition, Spandita Malik Jali, Matches of Resistance. This presentation marks the first solo museum exhibition for international photographer and social practice artist Spandita Malik and presents a brand new suite of works completed within the last year. Malik's practice is concerned with the global socio-political state of affairs with an emphasis on women's rights and gendered violence. She specializes in process-based work in photography and for the last 4 years has actively collaborated with women in India who embroider their own portraits and in doing so claim agency over their individual stories and portrayals. Malik earned her MFA in photography from the Parsons School of Design in 2019 and her BFA in fashion design from the National Institute of Fashion Technology in New Delhi, India. She previously exhibited work with notable galleries and organizations such as Jane Lombard Gallery, Somerset House, 21C Museum, H&R Block Art Space, Keene University Galleries, and the Oregon Center for the Photographic Arts, among many others. She has also participated in numerous residencies, such as the Charlotte Street Residency Program. You have reached your destination. You sure have. So yeah, she's participated in numerous residencies, including the Charlotte Street Residency Program, Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts, the Center for Photography, and Project for Empty Spaces. Malik's work has recently been featured on websites and publications such as ArtNet, Artsy, BuzzFeed, Musée, and the British Journal of Photography. Before I hand the mic over to Spandita, I just want to take a second to thank all of our amazing visitors, trustees, donors, and members whose continued support of the museum makes these special exhibitions possible. I also want to thank our dedicated staff here at Kemper, with particular praise to our exhibitions and marketing teams. They've been hard at work in the galleries and behind the scenes so that we can open not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 exhibitions this summer. They've basically been rotating shows since May and haven't stopped, so please have a drink in their honor tonight. So Spandita, the mic is now all yours, and after the artist talk, we'll open the floor for a brief Q&A session. Thanks. Welcome, Spandita.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to start talking a little bit about myself and a little background. As you must have heard, I am from India and I did my undergraduate studies in fashion design and I pursued my master's in photography. I grew up in this town called Chandigarh. It's towards the north of India, sort of in the foothills of Himalayas. It's a really small city and it's a beautiful city. And most of the time growing up, I thought it was the safest place to be, till it wasn't. I moved to New Delhi in 2017 to pursue my undergraduate studies, and it was my first time moving out of the house and, being in a big city, very young, very impressionable, very naive. And it was also, unfortunately, the first time, it was a year after the major gang rape case that had happened in New Delhi that was called Nirbhaya. The political climate around this particular rape case, and also just the idea of what it was to be a woman was sort of really in the forefront of the media at that point. As a young impressionable woman who had just moved to the city, I suddenly realized that all of these ideas that had been normalized to me, all of this abuse, gendered violence that has sort of been at the forefront of the media and newspaper throughout my life, that had been normalized for the longest period of time, it wasn't normal. And I suddenly realized that in my country, well, it's not just about inequality. Women are not just less than men, they're considered less than humans. And I'll get to that in a little bit. to explain why. This image right here is an image that I found recently. It is one of the earliest works that I made. I was really young when I made this one. And it was just sort of like an experiment that I did. In embroidery, I was learning how to do zardozi and beadwork. And for some reason, I wanted to do it over a photograph. So I had put it on fabric and I embroidered it. So I just wanted to start the presentation with this work today. Coming back to the idea of being a woman in India. So 2013, we are right after this major gang rape case that had happened, and it sort of had this massive protest that everyone was on the streets protesting. We got international media attention on this case. It was a truly brutal case that we had never heard about before. This 23-year-old girl, Jyoti Singh, was brutally gang raped and murdered on a bus. And it sort of made everyone vocalize why we were not talking about the rampant rape culture in India. After I moved to the US and I started sort of researching on rape culture and why this entire incident and sort of like a synthesis of like so many incidences had like created my identity, I started going back to this very pivotal point of the 2012 rape case. And I started going through newspaper archives and finding out clippings on what was being said about this particular rape case in the newspaper. This image that you see on the screen right now is a statement by the Chief Minister of New Delhi talking about this particular case, saying that one shouldn't be adventurous being a woman. I started collecting more and more of these newspaper clippings. And I started embroidering the parts of it that I thought needed to be focused on. But also what I didn't understand when I was starting to do this project was that the idea that what I was looking at was something that I had seen all my life. I had seen rape being reported this way all my life. It was always the woman's fault, right? She was on the bus, it was late, she was with her boyfriend, she was wearing some particular kind of clothes, she was from a particular kind of family, you know? All of those things sort of just made their way into all of these newspaper clippings. I'm going to read a little part of it that has been highlighted. Although a rape is reported in India every 21 minutes, on average, law enforcement failures mean that such crimes, a symptom of pervasive sexual and caste oppression, are often not reported or properly investigated, which is very true. We do not have proper rape laws. We don't have proper gendered violence laws. In India, we've made some changes, but we're not quite there yet. I started to take the idea of what this entire rape case was a visualization to me. Her body was thrown in a pile of garbage, and that's how she was found. And for some reason, and I don't completely justify why I had to make this work, and I don't completely understand why I had to make this work, I just needed to make a visual imagery of this woman so that people could see instead of imagining how brutal this was. Soon after, I started finding more newspaper clippings, but at this point I started to actually go inside of them and edit it out. I started to think about more on the lines of, what do we talk about when we talk about rape? How do we report it? What is the language that we're using? What are we emphasizing on? And I started to dig deeper into this idea. And I started to go in and just like edit out all of these newspaper clippings. 2018, while I was still working on these projects and I was still researching all of these statistics around rape, we had another really horrible rape case that had happened in India in 2018. Her name was Asifa Bano, and she was an 8-year-old girl. Her body was mutilated, and she was murdered because she was a Muslim. And it was a way of creating a message. At the same time, I was sort of investigating how journalism plays a part in the construct of rape and how we think about it. And I started reading about journalism laws in India, and at the same time, I sort of realized that there is a law against, in journalism, you cannot print a photograph of a corpse. And when I read that, and I was shocked because I was like, that is not possible. I have seen both Nirbhaya Jyoti Singh and Asifa Bano's photograph of their corpse in the newspaper. It was printed. And it sort of hit me at that point that while the laws were not being sort of completely followed in this case, these images also sort of became their last photographs that were present for everyone to see. You can Google this case right now. It's going to be the first photograph that's on the web. And it sort of destroyed a part of me because I was also reading about philosophy of photography, you know. Photographs are like really interesting. They contain so much information, they contain so much of these ideas of what that moment is, but also, you know, it's important to sort of remember that photographs are also sort of, you know, the death of that moment, right? Me in a photograph, it is the death of me in that moment that has been captured in a photograph and never to be relived again. While I was sort of thinking about that philosophy of photography, I realized that in this very case, it was the photograph of death, but it was also the photograph that sort of conveyed that there's not going to be another one to change the way we look at it. Death in India in photographs is also like a really interesting thing. So if you have a loved one and, you know, and they pass away, you would print a photograph of them, you'd put a garland around the photograph and you'd hang it in your house. And that sort of is a way for you to have them with you. And I've always thought about that as a really beautiful gesture that you don't really forget them. You know, you sort of remember them. And in that sort of like small gesture, you can keep them alive. So all of these things sort of were in my mind at that point, and I started to print out the photographs of the corpse of Asifa Bano and Nirbhaya Jyoti Singh on a very large scale. It was the size of my bed at the time. And I just started working on these and started changing the photographs to sort of make it look different, or anything that I could do to sort of abstract them in a way. And I started making these works, which are called Last Portraits of Her. And I think in my very sort of naive attempt of understanding all of these ideas around rape culture and also my personal attachment to this research at the time, I sort of think that this was my way of paying homage to these women and sort of creating a portrait that was the last portrait of them. It wasn't the photograph that was printed on the newspaper. And I asked a lot of my friends who came to my studio at the time, and I asked them, well, what do you see? You know, they didn't know what it was. They didn't know what photograph I'd been working on. And it sort of made me really happy and smile a little when they all said, well, it feels like an abstraction where you see a little bit of like flowers and like a field. And it just made me really happy because I was just like, okay, I sort of put the garland on the photograph of the deceased. Further into working into the documentation of rape and sort of the statistics around rape at the time, I started this series of work, and I think it was just because I'd sort of gone into the research of all of this to an extent where I realized that I was very helpless and I couldn't really make a change. I could just talk about it, and I could only spread the message, and that was all that I could do. So I started doing this work. It was sort of like a performance in the studio where I would start to write the word rape in Hindi over and over again on a piece of fabric. The number of times that I would write this word on the fabric would be the number of times it was reported in New Delhi that year. So on the left, you see a piece which is 2011, and the number of rapes reported in 2011 was 572. On the right, you see a piece from 2015, where the number of rapes reported were 2,199, at which point the fabric sort of tore and gave up. I continue doing this work, and I still do one every year. It's sort of like a practice to get the anger out, in a way. This brings me to Nari. I think this entire project sort of started while I was in the studio with all of my statistics on the wall. It sort of looked like, an investigation was going on in that studio. And my professor came in and he's like, okay, we need to get out of the studio now. And I think it was a very, very important advice for me at the point, because I had gotten way too close to the work, and it wasn't good. He suggested, he's like, well, you want to talk about rape culture, why don't you go and meet women, talk to them about their experiences, what's actually going on. So I did that. I went back to India, and I started traveling. I put together a list of all the non-for-profits that were working with abuse survivors at the time, and I started visiting these non-for-profit organizations. I went to Lucknow in Uttar Pradesh. I was also sort of deciding on the states that I wanted to go according to the number of rapes reported in that year, and this statistic is from 2019, which is 7,444. I went to Jaipur in Rajasthan with the number of rapes reported 5,997. And Punjab, the state that I'm from, the number of rapes reported 4,377. So I went in, I sort of started working at these non-for-profit organizations, started working with these women who were also affiliated with these centers. They were learning how to embroider, they were learning how to sew. They were sort of learning all these skills that could make them financially independent. While I was there and I had no idea what I was doing, I would talk to them, I would try to become friends with them. I would try for these women to feel comfortable around me, which is when I realized that there is a fundamental difference in an idea of what a project is supposed to be and the actual way of doing it. You can't just go up to people and talk about abuse. So I decided that I'm just gonna stay and work with the center and with the women. I'm just gonna show up every day. A few days later, I decided, well, if I'm going to show up every day, might as well do something. So I got all of these disposable cameras. I asked these women, I was like, well, can I teach your kids photography on disposable cameras? I'll do like a small workshop and they can run around and take photographs. And they agreed, and all of these kids, they would come back from school and they would just come into the workshop and we would do like small sort of, let's just go and click this, or let's go and click this. And it's just amazing because these kids, they were just so fascinated with disposable cameras. They've never seen film before. So that was really exciting. We sort of clicked all these photographs, I scanned them, printed them. We sort of had like a small pop-up show in the streets. It was just really fun. These are some of the photographs that they clicked. So I was sort of like interviewing this woman at the non-for-profit in Lucknow, and I was just like, I don't even know how you do this. Your embroidery is impeccable. It's beautiful. And she was like, well, if you really like this embroidery, you should come check out my friend's work, because she is actually really good. And I was like, okay, great, let's go meet your friend. So she's like, well, she doesn't come to the center, we have to go to her house. So I was like, okay, let's do that. I visited her friend, and soon after I realized that there was a huge community of these women who were sort of like affiliated with these non-for-profit organizations. They were working with the organizations, but they were not allowed to leave their houses by their husbands or their fathers, whoever was like the patriarch of the family. And for some reason, I asked a lot of them, I was like, well, why can't you leave? And they were like, it's not safe, it's not really safe. If they have time, we can go with them. So as soon as I realized that, I sort of started to photograph these women in the rooms that they used to live in. And at which point I was sort of like photographing these women. I always carry books with me when I'm in the field. Most of those books are about philosophy of photography because I just want to be in that zone, I guess. And the book that I was reading at this point was Decolonizing the Camera by Mark Seeley. And he sort of talks about how the idea of photography and the construct, the way that we build up an aesthetic of photography that has existed, needs to be, there is a need for it to be decolonized. And for me to understand that concept, I sort of started looking through the lens. Whatever I was clicking at the time, I sort of started to think about why I was clicking it the way that I was clicking it. Why was I taking a portrait in the way that I was taking it? And I realized something, which was that the photography that I'd grown up with has been these beautiful photographs of poverty that have been clicked from the outsider's eye. And that, for me, has been, for most of my life, beautiful work, right? And I mean, if you don't believe me, Google India photographs. You know what I'm talking about. And that's when I realized that, well, the aesthetic of how I look at the people of my country is sort of based off of my learning of looking at these photographs for most of my life. And something needed to change. Something needed to change in the way that I photographed. Talking about that, I always like to believe, and I tell everyone this all the time, that photographers have a lot of power. They do. The way that we can portray people, the way we decide to portray people, that's where the power lies, right? You can take a photograph, a second later, there are like 3 photographs, and you have your face a little turned around, and sort of creates this hint of sadness in your eyes. I'm going to pick that photograph, I'm going to display that, although you were laughing crazily like 2 seconds before that photograph was taken, right? I could portray you in the way that I want to. And someone who understands the power of photography, I decided that I'm going to share it. And that's how I'm going to decolonize this image. I started to print out these photographs on fabric, and at the time we were in villages and the resources that were available were like not as much. So I just printed out on like photocopy machines and like put them on fabric and just started this project. I asked these women to embroider these works in whatever way they wanted. There were no guidelines, there were no restrictions. They could do absolutely whatever they wanted. This is Rajni, and I'm handing her the portrait that I had printed out on fabric. This is how she embroidered it. And it was great, you know. I was like, wow, okay. I never asked her why she embroidered the way that she did. And she thought it was a weird ask that I wanted her to embroider the portrait. But she was also sort of excited, and she was like, well, did you like it? Is it good? And I was like, it's brilliant. I moved on, and I sort of knew, I didn't know completely what I was doing at the time, but I sort of knew that this is the way that it's working, so let's do this. Let's see how it works out. So I started photographing all of them in their rooms. I started printing them on fabric. I got a little more comfortable with, you know, the sort of like transfer techniques that I was using at the time, so I could increase the size of the portraits. This is Kosar. I met her in Jaipur, and when I was photographing her, she said, well, you know, you can't take my face, it's not allowed. And I was like, okay, what do we do? And I think like whenever we're like taking photographs, and this has just been like an always practice with portraits, is like making the subject very comfortable. And I think everyone feels more comfortable when they get to decide one thing in the photograph. Because they know that they have the power to dictate the photograph a little bit. And I like that. I asked her, I was like, well, what do you want to do? And she's like, well, I could read a newspaper. And I was like, great. So I found this newspaper, and I told her to hold it and read the newspaper. And it so happened that this photograph, the photograph on the newspaper just sort of seamlessly added to the portrait. I like when happy accidents like this happen. This is Nusrat Parveen. I met her in Lucknow. She embroidered her portrait. The embroidery that they do is also culturally famous to the state that they're from. So in Lucknow, it would be chikankari, which is like a shadow embroidery. They usually do it on the back of the fabric. So from the front, you can sort of see the stitch. And so she was also the oldest woman that I had worked with, and she is sort of the most amazing person I've ever met in my life. She has been sort of the go-to person for everyone in the community in Lucknow. Everyone, you know, she knows when, you know, someone has been arranged into a marriage, she'll check on them, and she'll be like, oh, how are you doing? You know, we all meet in the backyard if you want to come hang out sometime. You know, and she taught most of them embroidery. So she's sort of the person you go to if you're in trouble in that community. I took this portrait of her in her house, in her apartment, and she embroidered on top. She had like a whole, you know, flowers sort of embroidered on top of it. But when she sent me the portrait back, it had all of this emulsion that had like completely been erased. And, you know, I saw the work and I was like, oh my God, what happened? I called her and I was like, what happened with the portrait? And she's like, well, you know, I didn't want to send you something that was dirty. So I washed it and then I ironed it. And I thought, you know, for a second I was like, okay, but I think it took me a while, but I got to a realization about this work, which was that that's what moms do, right? if they see something of yours that's dirty, they're going to wash it and they're going to clean it so that it's clean. And I thought that was just what this portrait needed. It needed to be washed and ironed by her to add that element of extra care that comes with her personality. This is Feroza. I met her in Jaipur as well. I was teaching her kids photography, and she sort of opened up this whole community to me. She was sort of the person who would introduce me to everyone, and tell everyone like she's okay, we can trust her. Which is another thing that I think is like really beautiful about these works, is that when I had sort of started this project, there was like this apprehension of like being accepted into these, you just walk into someone's house, you're a stranger, how do you trust like each other, right? But I think over time I've like sort of it's become very valuable to me, this connection, this relationship, and this ease in which women are able to trust other women and create these spaces of trust. And over the years that I've known all of these women, I've sort of valued it even more, because it's sort of important for everyone to sort of create these spaces, these safe spaces. If you can, you will. And that's how you sort of are able to share your stories. This photograph is of Fozia. This was the first time I was doing this project, so everything that came back was like a complete shocker, because I did not know what they would do. Fozia over here, she embroiders her own portrait. The suit that she's wearing, she had sort of sewn it for herself. She wanted to go to fashion school, but no one wanted her to go because there wasn't one in the town that she was living in at the time. She sort of has embroidered the henna on her hands. She's put a veil on her face. And after this had been in my studio for a very long time, I realized that she not only puts a veil on her face, she also embroiders underneath. And that's the back of the work on the left. And not only does she embroider her face, she's also used different colors of thread to sort of like give shadows and highlights to the skin, which I thought was just, that attention to detail made this work everything. This is Lakbir Kaur. I met her in Chamkaur Sahib, which is a village. The village that I met her in is near Chamkaur Sahib. It's a further remote village. And when I met with her, she was very apprehensive of this entire project. She was like, I don't know what you want. You want to take a photograph of me? There is no light. And I was like, why is there no light? And she's like, there's no light, there's no electricity in this village. Which is when I realized that I was way farther into the state and in a very remote village. A lot of times I've realized that women sort of give me indications to when I am in an unsafe territory. They would always sort of, even if it's like the first time they've met me, they'll let me know. Like, do you know where you are? You need to like sort of take care of this. Or, it's like really late. Why don't you carry my knife with you? Like towards your car or something. And I've always sort of valued these small communications, even if it's, I haven't known them really long, and, I know that what they're saying is true, and I never doubt it. This is Radha Rani, and this was a photograph in her room. Everything that is on the wall and everything that's on the shelf, she sort of explained everything and why everything was there. When I was taking this photograph, she sort of put this pillow cover with embroidery on it, and I asked her after the photograph, I was like, why did you put it there? And she was like, well, that's my daughter's first embroidery. And I thought it was just beautiful that, these sort of small elements just keep adding to these images. Over the years, I've sort of, I was working on this project and I was talking to my mom and my grandmother and, these sort of ideas of these relationships that women have, these conversations that women have, and this sort of knowledge that is passed on, right? On how to be safe. Because safety is one thing that I don't think women take for granted, which is really, really sad to me. And at the same time, I thought of all of these other aspects of the relationships with women is this sort of legacy of, these sort of like techniques and different kinds of ways that you would like sit in the backyard on a winter morning and after your mom has sort of put like oil in your hair and you're just sitting there, you've had some fruits and you're just chilling, you would sort of sit down and like you would learn how to like embroider or knit or whatever else you're doing. And that was sort of like my childhood, the backyard that I sort of saw with these women. There was also this space where they would come together, sit, talk about their day, embroider. Was sort of a very similar setting that I'd grown up with. Those winter mornings that I just described, sitting with my grandmother and my mom, who would teach me, who taught me embroidery, who taught me how to knit, how to crochet, all of those things. That whole space of learning and also knowing that my grandmother taught my mom how to embroider, my mom taught me, and it was sort of just like this legacy that was being passed on, right? And I've been thinking about it a lot, and that's why I wrote this. There's always been a sense of legacy being passed among women through this language of embroidery and handcraft, inherited by generations of women and passed along to break the oppressor by simple but significant hand movements captured on fabric, written in thread. I continued this project over the next year after graduating. I went back and I photographed more women, and at this point I sort of built a foundation with all of these women, so it was easier to get access to other people, other women, and also sort of have this. I had a better idea of what I was doing at this point, so it was easier for me to know what questions to ask. When I say what questions to ask, it's more about the fact that I started to train myself in how to interview and talk about abuse. Talking about abuse is very difficult, If you're trying to talk to your best friend about it, it's still very difficult. But if you're trying to talk to a stranger who you barely know and you want to ask them all of these questions, it's very, very difficult. And which is why I sort of tried to understand as much as I could the language that could be used in talking about abuse. So I went back and I met with these women and I started to interview them very seriously this time. And I asked them, and I thought it would be difficult, but for some reason, they shared their stories with me. And until this date, I feel like these stories are sort of a starting point for our relationship and sort of the community that we've built, is because they trusted me, and I truly value that a lot. This is Sarfaraz. I took a photograph in Jaipur, and she has sort of embroidered her work here. Every inch of this portrait has so many different parts of embroidery and beads that have been sewn into. And one day in the studio, I realized that the entire, the section of the doors and the windows above the doors have been painted black. So she took out all of the details that were there in the portrait and and embroidered on top of it. She sort of like created focus on herself. On the left, you could see a little bit about her room. On the right, you could see a little bit about someone else's room, but it was all sort of stripped black, and it was that was just really interesting. This is Parveen Devi. Parveen is just, she's really funny and she loves making fun on my account, but she's awesome. And I met her, this is the first time that I had met her, and I took a portrait of her, and while I was taking a portrait of her, her mother-in-law was sort of screaming in the background because she was just like, why are you taking her photograph? And she was just like completely like, just ignore her. But also, like, you could see from the photograph, I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna be able to get like a proper portrait of her because, you know, what's happening around us right now. But I was just really shocked when I saw this image, and she was just completely calm. But while we entered this room, she pointed out to the portrait that is hanging on the top right of this frame, and she said, those are all the men in the house. I was like, okay. And I never asked, and I was just like, okay, this is something that is really important, so I'm going to try taking it into the photograph, and I was clicking it. And I was sort of just like completely squeezed myself towards the wall and tried to take this portrait into the photograph. But when she like ended up embroidering this, what was so interesting to me, and I don't know if this was her intention, but I feel like she gave herself an army to compete for the men in the photograph. But that's just my interpretation, which is like another part of like the works is that whenever they come back, I'm always like, I am half the viewer of my own work. Sort of like it that way now. This is Sabah Qureshi, and this is her room. She has sort of embroidered in Arabic. It says, like the clouds covered a part of the sun, she covered a part of her face and revealed the other. This is Sindhu. I think this was the last day of the entire trip, and she is the busiest person, and it's as soon as I would like enter her place or I would like see her, she'd be like, okay, I gotta get the kids to school and I gotta make all the food. Are you eating? Are you staying to eat? Are you staying the night? What's happening with you? I need to take care of all of these things. And we never got to click a photograph. And it was the very end of when I had to leave. I finally got her to sort of get clicked. This is an install shot from a recent show at Blue Sky Gallery in Portland. Soon after, it was right into the pandemic, and I wasn't able to go back home because the border shut down, and I did not know how to continue this project anymore. So I sort of just shut myself in the studio, but at the same time, what happened was that I started getting calls from all of the women that I'd been working with for 2 years now that no one was buying embroideries. And so they were completely out of business and they really needed some financial assistance. So at that point, I decided that I'm just going to be in the studio and I'm going to work. So I asked them, why don't you take a blank canvas, which is your fabric, and just embroider whatever you want, and I'll try creating an image on top of it. And this was just sort of like an experiment that I did like right in the beginning of the pandemic. This is a sun print, like multiple layers of sun printing on top of fabric. But I think this project was also sort of created out of necessity. I realized that while they needed to like embroider and they needed to have some financial assistance, I needed to keep making work and we needed to keep talking, because the world was apparently coming to an end at that time. So I was just like, well, we're just going to experiment and see how it goes. These are photographs that I had taken in their houses before, and I sort of created these sun prints out of them on embroidery. In 2021, this was May 2021, which is when I had decided I don't care. The borders opened up. I was like, I'm going back. I'm going back to India. I'm going to be in the field. I'm going to work, and I'll see what happens. But the day that my flight, I was supposed to actually leave, the border shut down again, and I was unable to leave. And at which point I was completely devastated because I actually wanted to go back home and be with my family because my father was sick. But at the same time, I wanted to go back and sort of continue the work. What happened right after was, as soon they shut down the borders because it was the worst surge of COVID cases that India had ever seen that was happening at that time. And while it was affecting a lot of people, I started getting calls from all of these women who were talking about, well, there is a lack of oxygen. My husband, my friend, my sister, whoever, they're in the hospital. We can't find beds. We can't find resources. We don't know what to do. Can you help somehow? And I did not know what to do sitting in the States. So I started a WhatsApp group with all of the women from all of the states. And I started sharing resources on those WhatsApp groups from where to find, who's selling oxygen or whatever I could find on social media at the time, or I could talk to people back home. And this sort of WhatsApp group was also out of necessity, but it sort of soon, right after the surge, became about sharing recipes and, becoming friends. And it was sort of the next step of this community sort of coming together. And while this was all happening, I think I got on a call one day with all of them when they could figure out the internet, and everyone had someone had a phone that had internet, and I could actually get on a video chat with them. And they were sitting in the backyard, and we were talking, and they were talking about, the whole community had gone through a lot of grief at this point. I was getting a call from my mom every day telling me some relative had passed away. It was just a very weird sort of, it was just a very morbid time, I guess. And I think I've sort of deleted a big chunk of that time from my memory. But this call that I did with all of the women, we were talking, and they were telling me about who they lost and what was happening on the ground, and what the media was not telling everyone about what was actually happening. And, they were like, okay, well, we've talked about everything, and this is just getting really sad. So let's talk about something that is happy. And they're like, well, actually, on that note, you're of marriageable age, right? And I was like, yeah, what do you mean? What is marriageable age? And they're like, well, the world is coming to an end, so why don't you just get married? And I thought that was just really hilarious, and I just completely laughed it off. But I think right after the call, it sort of dawned on me that while I've been working with these women and we've been talking about domestic abuse, I don't know anything about when they got married. A lot of women in India they're either arranged into a marriage or they are married really early, especially in villages, which is when I started to ask them questions about their weddings and how old were they when they got married, under what circumstances. And this sort of opened up this entire project that we were able to do via international mail and phone calls and WhatsApp. They started to sit in the backyards and share with each other their wedding albums and look at photographs that they picked out of themselves. And they started sharing with me the stories. And while they started to share these stories, it was just really interesting because these women would talk about how they were so naive and did not know the person they're with. and the memories that were instilled in these photographs and how they sort of resonated with them so differently now. And I thought it would be interesting if they could go back and sort of embroider those portraits and sort of reclaim the power or the agency that they didn't probably have when these photographs were taken. So we started this project, which was completely in the pandemic. This is Sarfaraz again. This is a photograph of her honeymoon. And when she sent me this photograph, she asked me to sort of crop out the photograph. And if you see on the right, you could see like the hand of the person. She's like, can you please crop him out of the photograph? And I was like, okay, let's do that. This is at the Taj Mahal. This is Rajni Mehra. Rajni she really wanted to work on the project, but at the same time, she sort of did not have any photograph of her that she could find. She said, well, I can click a photograph, but I don't have any old photographs of me. So she really wanted to work on the project, so she sort of took out the small photograph from her her ration card, which is sort of like an SSN card here, and sent me this really small photograph of her that was on this card. And I sort of enlarged it, and it had all of this like pigment and like pixelation that happened. But it was just really interesting the way that she had embroidered this portrait. You can never see what the image was, pixelated before that. This work was presented in a show at Baxter Street in New York. Ever since, I've continued working on the series with them. Last year in June, I was finally able to go back home. After 3 years of not being able to go back to India, I was able to go back home and meet with my family and meet with the women that I'd been working with. And, when I went back home, it was, my mom hugged me. We had been separated for 3 years. It was just this entire feeling of, oh my God, I'm home. But then I went to meet with the women, and, I remembered the ways, and I was sort of going to the houses, and I was like, I remember these lanes, I remember all of these things. This is where we used to do the workshops. This is where we used to sort of the kids would take photographs. And I met with them, and they hugged me, and it was the same exact feeling. It was going home. And I started to work with these women again, and at this point, the ease of working those relationships that have already been built, and it was like working with moms or friends, and it was really fun. And we, they sort of know now that the work gets shown outside of a school, because when I had started working, I was a student. So they're always very excited about the photographs. They're like, okay, wait, I'm gonna go change. I've already cleaned the room. So I never get to, unless I surprise them, I never get a very candid of their rooms anymore, or themselves anymore, because they know that these works go places, so they make an effort to sort of make the portrait. And I like that. I like that, they're sort of also becoming a creative agency of building this work in however way they want to present themselves. Oh, okay. Ooh.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to open the floor now for a quick Q&A session for anyone who may have questions about Spandita's practice or any sort of lingering curiosities. So please, don't be shy.
Hi, On all your pieces in the other room, they would either say that they have khadi or khadar fabric. I was wondering what the difference was.
Yeah. So both khadi and khadar are sort of like the genesis of those fabrics is the same. It's khadi. And khadi is this fabric that is sort of, it's hand-spun, hand-woven fabric that has a lot to do with the independence movement in India. Khadi sort of became like a symbol of self-reliance. And it was a whole movement that was started by Mahatma Gandhi that we would make our own fabric from scratch. So it was hand-woven and hand-spun and hand-woven. But the difference between khadi and khadar is that it's from different states, and different states use different yarns. So khadi would be from the Rajasthan region, and it would be a little less coarse fiber, whereas khadar would be more coarse. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about the technology that you used to put the photograph on the fabric, and if you consistently used a certain type of fabric because that worked the best for that technology.
I've been using photographic heat transfer paper from the very beginning. When I started working in the field, like in the very beginning, I was using like really small paper, but now I've started as I've expanded the size of the work, I can like print bigger. But I mean, for the fabric, I could technically get like a digital print of the images, and that would be a better print. But also, I feel like the fabric has so much to do with the history of the region, and also all of the women, whenever I ask them, what do you usually embroider on? They tell me what fabric they use, and I just want to make sure that they have that specific fabric to embroider on.
I'm curious if there were any repercussions against these women or you personally, socially, politically, for doing this project.
Thank you for asking that question. I'm trying to figure out which one to tell you. I think the worst one that sort of happened in my presence was when I was trying to photograph Radha in 2019. So I usually ask them, like, when do I come over? Because some of the women, their husbands don't know that they're working with the centers. So they would sort of those works would always remain small, so they can always conceal those works. But at the same time, like when I want to photograph them, I'll ask them, what time can I come to your house? And it usually will be, all of the photographs are always taken between like noon and 2 or 3 because the husbands aren't home. But this one particular day, I was photographing Radha, and her husband came home, and he was really shocked to see me there with all my camera and gear and tripods all set up, and he was just like, what's going on? And while I get it that he was surprised, but he didn't completely have a very normal human reaction. He started hitting her, and she told me to leave as soon as that happened. And since I got really scared, and I was the only one that day, I did not have my assistant with me, just carried my stuff and left, and I apologized to her. But from that day, I think we met the very next day, and I talked to her about this. And I was like, well, if this person's not really afraid to do that when I am there, then I don't even know what he does when no one's there. And that I think that would be like the one time during the project where it was, everything that we had talked about was very much in front of my eyes.
How are these women compensated financially?
These women are compensated for their work when the works get made. initially I started this whole idea of like creating this project as like this financial way of financing them for like every time the work got acquired. But then I realized very soon that, you know, not all works get acquired, and how do I sort of like divide that up? So from the very beginning, even when I was a student, they get compensated for the work as soon as the works are made. And it's a funny story because I remember asking them, I was like, well, how much do you charge for this size of embroidery? And I was a fashion design student. I know what embroidery costs, right? And the amount that they said to me was just so less that I did not know what to do. But I sort of created this thing. I collaborated with a friend of mine, and we did a workshop on how to negotiate for prices with the non-for-profits. But they are compensated 3 times of what they asked for in the very beginning. Yeah.
Hello. I just have, it's a mix of 2 questions, but they're not like super complex. Out of the set that you've presented to us, do you have a particular print that you'd say was your favorite? And where are you going from here?
Thank you. I don't think I have a favorite work. I think I have like a set of favorite works, but I don't have like one particular favorite work. I feel like I'm just like way too close to the work, and I know way too much about them, and I can read into the work way too much, that even like, you know, if I had a favorite, like it wouldn't be like a good opinion in a way. I have been working since last year on expanding the project. In India, I have been working in 2 more states. I started work with a non-for-profit organization in Chamba, which is in Himachal Pradesh, and the embroidery that they are working on there is sort of like an endangered embroidery. There are 8 women who know how to do this embroidery, and that's it. So I've been working with the Ministry of Textile in sort of building grants and sort of ways for these women to sort of teach embroidery so that it's not a lost craft. But I also started to sort of collaborate with them in the same way that I've been working before. And I've also sort of very briefly started working in Kashmir.